My husband's been declared brain dead for 6 months. His eyes just blinked out our wedding date in binary. I saw it at 11:15 on a Wednesday night. Julian's eyes moved in a pattern I recognized instantly. Long blink, short, 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 long, short, long, long. 8 blinks total. 08152018, August 15th, 2018. Our wedding date. My hand jerked away from his arm like I'd been burned. I'd been sitting beside his hospital bed for 6 months, holding his hand, talking to him, reading to him, and his eyes had never moved with purpose. The doctors said brain-dead patients sometimes had reflexes, involuntary movements, but this wasn't random. This was deliberate. This was Julian communicating in the binary code we'd created together during our honeymoon, a private language for sending each other secret messages. He was a software engineer. I was a data analyst. Binary was our love language, stupid and romantic and ours. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, and started recording. His eyes stayed still for 30 seconds. Then the pattern repeated. Exact same sequence. 08152018. I pressed the call button for the nurse with enough force to hurt my thumb. The night nurse was a woman named Stephanie, who'd been kind to me over the months, who brought me coffee and didn't make me feel pathetic for spending every night in this room. She arrived within a minute, saw my face, and immediately checked Julian's monitors. What happened? Is he okay? I showed her the video, rewinding it twice. His eyes. Look at the pattern. That's not random. That's binary code. He's spelling out our wedding date. Stephanie watched carefully, her professional mask firmly in place. Mrs. Reeves, I understand you want to see signs of consciousness, but eye movements in brain-dead patients are actually common. The brainstem can still produce reflexes even when higher brain function is completely absent. It's called the oculocephalic reflex. I wanted to scream. This isn't a reflex. Count the blinks. It's the same pattern twice. 8 blinks in a specific sequence that translates to a date that means something only to us. Stephanie's expression softened into pity, which felt worse than skepticism. Let me page Dr. Vargas. He's on call tonight. Dr. Raymond Vargas arrived 20 minutes later, looking tired and irritated at being called for what he clearly assumed was another desperate family member seeing miracles where none existed. I'd met him 3 times over the past 6 months, always during moments when I'd questioned the diagnosis, always during moments when he'd patiently explained that Julian was gone and keeping him on life support was only prolonging the inevitable. He watched my video without comment, then performed a series of neurological tests on Julian, shining lights in his eyes, checking reflexes, monitoring brain activity. Everything came back exactly as it had for 6 months. No higher brain function, no response to stimuli, no consciousness. Dr. Vargas turned to me with the weary patience of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. Mrs. Reeves, what you've captured is consistent with spontaneous eye movement. The pattern you're seeing is coincidental. Your husband's brain scans show no activity in the regions responsible for intentional communication. I know how difficult this is, but creating meaning from random movements will only make your grief harder. I asked if they could run new tests, more comprehensive scans, anything to verify whether Julian might have some level of consciousness they'd missed. Dr. Vargas sighed. We've run every test available. Multiple EEGs, CT scans, MRIs, cerebral blood flow studies. All of them confirm the same diagnosis. Julian experienced catastrophic brain damage during his cardiac arrest. The person you married isn't coming back. His words were meant to be compassionate, but they landed like blows. Then explain the pattern. Explain how random eye movements perfectly replicate a binary sequence that spells out a date that only Julian and I know about. Dr. Vargas glanced at Stephanie, who looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Reeves, grief can make us see patterns that aren't there. The human brain is wired to find meaning, especially when we desperately want it. I strongly suggest you speak with our grief counselor. This level of denial isn't healthy for you. He left before I could argue further, and Stephanie followed after squeezing my shoulder and promising to check on me later. I sat alone with Julian, watching his face for any hint of movement, any sign that what I'd seen was real. His eyes remained closed now, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision from the ventilator. He looked exactly as he had since the day of his accident, peaceful and absent, a body without a person inside it. The accident had happened 6 months ago on a random Monday morning. Julian had been riding his bike to work, something he did every day, when a delivery truck ran a red light and hit him. The impact threw him 15 feet. He wasn't breathing when the paramedics arrived. They revived him, but not before his brain had been deprived of oxygen for nearly 8 minutes. The neurologist said anything over 6 minutes typically caused irreversible damage. Julian never woke up. After 2 weeks of testing and waiting, they declared him brain dead and suggested I consider organ donation. I refused. I insisted they keep him on life support, convinced he'd wake up, convinced the doctors were wrong, convinced our love was strong enough to pull him back. 6 months later, everyone except me had accepted he was gone. His parents had signed off on removing life support. His sister visited once a month and cried quietly before leaving. My own family stopped asking how I was doing, started suggesting I move on, started hinting that my vigil was unhealthy. Only I remained, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, going home only to shower and change clothes, living in the hospital like a ghost haunting a grave. My job had fired me after 3 months. My savings were nearly gone. My friends had stopped calling. But I stayed because some part of me knew, absolutely knew, that Julian was still in there. And now I had proof, even if no one believed me. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. Brain death versus coma versus locked-in syndrome versus minimally conscious state. The differences were technical and stark. Brain death meant complete cessation of all brain function, including the brainstem, which controlled automatic functions like breathing and reflexes. Coma meant unconsciousness, but with some brain activity. Locked-in syndrome meant full consciousness trapped in a paralyzed body. Minimally conscious meant some awareness but severely impaired function. Julian had been diagnosed as brain dead, which meant he shouldn't be able to blink deliberately, shouldn't be able to produce patterns, shouldn't be able to communicate. But the video on my phone said otherwise. I watched it again, counting each blink, translating the pattern, confirming the sequence. 0815218. August 15th, 2018. Our wedding date. No coincidence. No random reflex. Julian had sent me a message using the code only we knew. The code we'd invented on our honeymoon when we'd spent an entire afternoon creating elaborate binary messages for each other like lovesick teenagers. He'd proposed using binary on a sticky note left on my computer. I decoded it immediately, laughed and cried simultaneously, and said yes by writing the binary for yes on his bathroom mirror. Our entire relationship had been built on patterns, codes, inside jokes that made sense only to us, and now he was using our language to tell me he was still here. At midnight, his eyes moved again. I was watching this time, recording continuously, and I caught the entire sequence. Same pattern. 8 blinks. Our wedding date. Then something new. More blinks. Longer sequence. I counted frantically, writing down ones and zeros as they came. When he stopped, I had 32 blinks recorded. I pulled up a binary translator on my phone and typed in the sequence. Help. My breath caught in my throat. Julian was asking for help. Not just communicating. Not just proving consciousness. Asking to be saved from something. I grabbed my phone and called the one person I thought might actually listen to me. Might actually believe me, might actually help. My brother-in-law, Graham, was a neurologist at a different hospital, someone who'd remained skeptical of Julian's diagnosis from the beginning. He'd raised questions about the testing protocols, suggested the declaration of brain death had been premature, but he'd been overruled by the attending physicians at this facility. When I told him what I'd seen, what I'd recorded, he said he'd be there in 30 minutes. Graham arrived looking like he'd thrown on clothes and run out the door, his hair uncombed and his eyes sharp with focus. I showed him both videos. He watched them 3 times each, asking questions about timing, about Julian's medical history, about the specific tests that had been performed. Then he examined Julian himself, performing assessments I didn't understand, checking responses, taking notes. When he finished, he sat down heavily in the chair beside mine and said, "This shouldn't be possible if he's truly brain dead. Either the diagnosis is wrong, or something very unusual is happening." I asked what he meant by unusual. Graham pulled up Julian's medical files on his tablet, scrolling through test results and doctor's notes. Brain death is supposed to be irreversible. Complete absence of brain function including brainstem reflexes. But your videos show purposeful eye movement, which requires brainstem function at minimum and cortical function for the patterned communication. That's inconsistent with brain death. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There have been cases, very rare cases, where patients were misdiagnosed as brain dead when they were actually in a locked-in state or deep coma. The testing protocols are supposed to prevent that, but mistakes happen. I asked if Julian could be locked in, fully conscious but unable to move or communicate except through eye movements. Graham said it was possible, that locked-in syndrome was often misdiagnosed initially because patients appeared completely unresponsive. But here's what concerns me, he continued. If Julian has been conscious this whole time, if he's been trapped and aware for 6 months while everyone treated him like he was already dead, that's a level of psychological torture I can't even imagine. And if the medical team here missed the diagnosis, if they declared him brain dead without proper verification, that's malpractice of the highest order. He said he'd request a full neurological workup from an independent facility, that he'd push for advanced imaging and consciousness assessment protocols, but he warned me that the hospital would resist. They'd invested 6 months in a diagnosis. Admitting error would open them to massive liability. They'd fight to protect themselves, not Julian. Graham left at 2 a.m, promising to start making calls first thing. I stayed with Julian, holding his hand, whispering that I knew he was there, that I was going to get him out, that he just needed to hold on. At 3:15, Julian's eyes moved again. Different pattern this time. Longer sequence. I recorded it. My hands steadier now that I knew what I was looking for. 40 blinks. I translated them in real time. Trapped. My heart broke and rebuilt itself simultaneously. He was confirming everything I'd suspected, everything I'd been told was impossible. Julian was conscious. Julian was aware. Julian had been trapped in his paralyzed body for 6 months, unable to scream or move or signal except now, somehow, through his eyes. I asked him questions, told him to blink once for yes, twice for no, Can you hear me? 1 blink. Are you in pain? 2 blinks. Do you know where you are? 1 blink. Can you feel anything? 2 blinks. Are you scared? 1 long blink, held for 3 seconds. Yes. Absolutely yes. I told him I was going to get him out, that Graham was helping, that we'd find doctors who would listen. His eyes moved again. 3 blinks. I waited for more. Nothing came. I didn't know what 3 blinks meant in our binary system. It wasn't part of our code. Maybe it meant I love you. Maybe it meant hurry. Maybe it meant don't leave me. The next morning, Dr. Vargas arrived with hospital administration. A woman in a corporate suit introduced herself as Jennifer Wu, patient relations director, and said they needed to discuss my concerning behavior. I knew immediately that this was about protecting the hospital, not helping Julian. Jennifer sat down and spoke in that measured tone people use when trying to seem reasonable while delivering threats. Mrs. Reeves, we understand you're struggling with your husband's condition. Grief is a process, and denial is a natural stage. However, your insistence that your husband is communicating, your recording of his involuntary movements, and your recruitment of outside medical professionals to question our diagnosis is creating problems. Dr. Vargas and his team are confident in their assessment. Your husband is brain dead. Continuing to spread alternative theories is both harmful to your own mental health and potentially damaging to the hospital's reputation. I asked if they'd reviewed the videos, if they'd considered running additional tests. Jennifer's smile never wavered. We've reviewed your videos. Dr. Vargas has explained that what you're interpreting as communication is actually spontaneous movement. We will not be running additional tests because they're medically unnecessary and not covered by insurance. She pulled out papers from her folder. What we are prepared to do is offer you support during this difficult transition. We have grief counselors available. We can help facilitate the organ donation process. We can ensure Julian's passing is peaceful and dignified. The word passing hit me like a slap. He's not passing. He's alive. He's communicating. And you're refusing to investigate because admitting you were wrong would cost you money and reputation. Jennifer's expression hardened. Mrs. Reeves, we've been extraordinarily patient with you. We've allowed you to essentially live in this hospital for 6 months. We've accommodated your denial far longer than is typical. But that patience has limits. If you continue to disrupt hospital operations, if you continue to harass our staff with conspiracy theories, we'll be forced to restrict your visitation rights. Dr. Vargas added, we're trying to help you accept reality. Your husband is gone. The body in that bed is being kept artificially alive by machines. The kindest thing you can do is let him go. I looked at both of them and realized they weren't going to help. They couldn't help. Admitting error meant lawsuits, meant destroyed careers, meant public scandal. They'd rather let Julian die than admit they might have misdiagnosed him. After they left, I called Graham and told him everything. He swore under his breath and said, they're circling the wagons. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're going to fight any attempt to reassess Julian because they've committed to their diagnosis. But here's the thing. Legally, you're still his wife and his medical power of attorney. You have the right to transfer him to another facility if you want a second opinion. They can't stop you. I asked if he could arrange a transfer to his hospital. Graham hesitated. I can try, but it's complicated. Julian's on full life support. Transportation is risky, expensive, and requires extensive coordination. Plus, my hospital administration will want to know why we're accepting a patient another facility has declared brain dead. They'll be worried about liability too. He paused. But I have another idea. There's a researcher at the university, Dr. Elena Cross, who specializes in consciousness assessment. She's developed new imaging techniques that can detect awareness in patients who appear unresponsive. She's testified in several cases where patients were misdiagnosed. If we can get her to evaluate Julian, if she can document that he's conscious, that's evidence even the hospital can't ignore. Graham contacted Dr. Cross, sent her the videos, explained the situation. She agreed to come evaluate Julian, but warned that the hospital might refuse her access. She was right. When Dr. Cross arrived the next afternoon with her portable imaging equipment, hospital security stopped her at Julian's door. They said she wasn't credentialed at this facility and couldn't examine patients without authorization. Dr. Cross, a small woman in her 60s with steel in her eyes, asked who could provide authorization. They said Dr. Vargas would need to approve any outside consultation. Dr. Vargas, when called, refused. He said additional testing was unnecessary and potentially harmful to the patient. Dr. Cross pulled out her phone and called someone, had a brief conversation, then turned to the security guards. I've just spoken with the state medical board. I'm informing them that this hospital is refusing to allow consciousness assessment of a patient whose legal guardian has requested evaluation. That's a potential violation of patient rights statutes. You can either let me examine this patient now, or you can explain to investigators why you blocked a legally requested consultation. The security guards looked at each other, clearly out of their depth. One radioed someone. 5 minutes later, Jennifer Wu appeared, looking furious but cornered. She granted Dr. Cross 1 hour to perform her assessment, with strict conditions. Hospital staff would be present. Results would be reviewed by their team before any official conclusions were drawn, and no information could be released to media or legal representatives without hospital approval. Dr. Cross agreed to the conditions and got to work. She set up her portable functional MRI equipment, explaining to me that it measured brain activity in real time. looking for patterns consistent with conscious awareness. She'd developed specific protocols for detecting consciousness in patients who couldn't communicate traditionally. While the equipment calibrated, she asked me questions about Julian's personality, interests, preferences. Then she began the assessment. She'd ask Julian questions while monitoring his brain activity. "Julian, if you can hear me, try to imagine playing tennis." Pause while she watched the screens. "Now imagine walking through your house." Another pause. "Think about your wedding day." I watched the monitors, seeing colored regions light up on brain images. Dr. Cross's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away while Dr. Vargas and Jennifer watched over her shoulder. The assessment took 90 minutes, longer than the agreed hour, but no one stopped her. When she finished, Dr. Cross packed up her equipment and said she'd need to analyze the data before drawing conclusions. Jennifer insisted the results be sent to hospital administration first. Dr. Cross agreed, but I saw her hand me a business card with her personal cell number written on the back. She left without saying anything else, but her eyes told me she'd found something. I waited in Julian's room, holding his hand, watching for eye movements. He blinked twice, slow and deliberate. I didn't know if that meant anything, but I squeezed his hand in response. My phone rang at 8 that evening. Dr. Cross. She spoke quickly, quietly, like someone worried about being overheard. "Mrs. Reeves, I'm calling you from my personal phone. The hospital hasn't received my official report yet, and they won't like what it says. Your husband shows clear evidence of consciousness. His brain activity patterns during the assessment were consistent with intentional thought and response to external stimuli. He's not brain dead. He's not even in a vegetative state. He appears to be in a locked-in syndrome variant, fully conscious but unable to move or communicate except through limited eye control." I felt vindication and horror simultaneously. Julian had been aware this entire time. Aware while doctors discussed disconnecting his life support. Aware while his family said goodbye. Aware while he was treated like a corpse waiting to happen. Dr. Cross continued, "I'm sending you a copy of my report now. You need to get a lawyer immediately. This is massive medical malpractice. The hospital's testing protocols failed catastrophically. But here's what you need to understand. Once the hospital receives my official report, they're going to panic. They might try to rush removing life support before you can act. They might claim the report is flawed. They'll definitely try to prevent this from becoming public." She gave me the name of a medical malpractice attorney she'd worked with before, someone who specialized in cases involving misdiagnosed patients. She said I should call tonight. That time was critical. After we hung up, I forwarded the report to Graham and the attorney. Then I stayed with Julian, telling him we had proof, telling him he was going to be okay, telling him the nightmare was almost over. His eyes moved. Long blink, short, long. 4 blinks. I didn't need to translate it. I knew what it meant. Hurry. The attorney, David Kleinman, called me at midnight after reviewing Dr. Cross's report. "This is one of the worst cases I've seen in 20 years of practice. The hospital declared your husband brain dead based on incomplete testing, kept him on life support for 6 months while treating him as unconscious, and now has proof that he's been aware the entire time. That's not just malpractice. That's potential criminal negligence." He said he'd file emergency motions first thing in the morning. Temporary restraining order preventing the hospital from removing life support, court order demanding transfer to another facility, and preliminary malpractice claims establishing our legal position. But he warned me that the hospital would fight viciously. They're looking at tens of millions in damages, possibly hundreds of millions depending on how long Julian remains impaired and what his recovery looks like. They'll claim Dr. Cross's assessment is flawed, that she's biased because you paid her, that Julian's eye movements are coincidental. They'll bring in their own experts, drag this out, try to exhaust you financially and emotionally. He asked if I was prepared for a long legal battle. I said I'd been fighting for 6 months already. What was a few more? The restraining order was granted the next morning. A judge reviewed Dr. Cross's report and ruled that Julian could not be removed from life support until a full hearing could be conducted. The hospital immediately filed an appeal, claiming the assessment was fraudulent, and that keeping Julian on life support against medical advice was cruel. Media got involved somehow, probably leaked by someone at the hospital trying to spin the narrative. News vans appeared in the parking lot. Reporters called my phone asking for comments. Headlines appeared, "Woman claims brain-dead husband is communicating," and "Hospital denies consciousness in long-term patient," and "Medical ethics debate erupts over life support case." I stopped reading after the third article called me a desperate widow, unable to accept reality. The public pressure worked both ways. Patient advocacy groups rallied to Julian's defense, calling for independent assessment and greater safeguards against misdiagnosis. Medical ethicists debated on news shows whether hospitals had too much power to declare patients brain dead. Disability rights organizations demanded better consciousness detection protocols. The hospital was taking a public relations beating, which made them more dangerous, more desperate to shut this down. On the 4th night after Dr. Cross's assessment, someone tried to disconnect Julian's ventilator. I'd stepped out to use the bathroom, gone for maybe 3 minutes, and when I came back, a nurse I'd never seen before was standing beside Julian's bed with her hand on the ventilator controls. She froze when she saw me, then said she was just checking the settings. I asked her name, asked who'd sent her, asked why she was in my husband's room at 2 in the morning doing routine checks that weren't on the schedule. She left without answering. I immediately called hospital security and reported the incident. They took a statement, promised to investigate, and did nothing. David Kleinman filed a police report for attempted harm to a patient. Police said they'd look into it but seemed skeptical. Graham started staying overnight with me, taking shifts so Julian was never alone. We set up cameras in the room, documenting everything. The hospital administration sent a formal complaint about the cameras, claiming we were violating patient privacy. David Kleinman responded that we were protecting our patient from the hospital, and the cameras were staying. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which felt like an eternity. During that time, I worked with a communication specialist to establish a reliable system for Julian to express himself. We started with simple yes-no questions using single blinks versus double blinks, then graduated to more complex binary sequences. The specialist, Dr. Ruth Zimmerman, was patient and creative, developing ways for Julian to communicate letters, words, eventually full thoughts. It was slow and exhausting for him, but it worked. One afternoon, I asked Julian what he wanted most. He blinked out a response that took 15 minutes to complete. Tell them I'm here. Tell them what they did. Make them pay. Dr. Zimmerman documented everything, creating video records of Julian's communications, demonstrating clear cognitive function and intentional response. The evidence was overwhelming. Julian could answer personal questions only he would know. He could solve math problems. He could indicate preferences and make decisions. He was absolutely, undeniably conscious. Yet the hospital's lawyers continued to claim the diagnosis was correct, that any apparent responsiveness was misinterpretation or coincidence, that Dr. Cross's assessment was unreliable. They brought in their own expert, a neurologist named Dr. Philip Thornton, who examined Julian for 30 minutes and declared there was no evidence of consciousness. Dr. Thornton's report claimed the eye movements were reflexive, that the binary patterns were coincidental, that families often projected meaning onto random events. David Kleinman tore the report apart, pointing out that Dr. Thornton had connections to the hospital's insurance company, that his assessment had been cursory at best, that he'd refused to use advanced imaging techniques that might contradict his conclusions. The hearing finally arrived. I sat in a courtroom watching lawyers argue about whether my husband was conscious, watching doctors present contradictory testimony, watching a judge try to make sense of medical evidence that shouldn't have been complicated. Julian was conscious. Multiple independent experts confirmed it. Video documentation proved it. Yet the hospital's legal team fought every point, trying to create doubt, trying to protect their institution from accountability. Graham testified about the inadequate testing protocols, about how the original brain death assessment had been rushed and incomplete. Dr. Cross testified about her findings, explaining in detail how the brain activity patterns proved consciousness. Dr. Zimmerman testified about Julian's communications, demonstrating clear cognitive function. The hospital's lawyers attacked every witness, questioned every methodology, suggested every expert was biased or incompetent. They brought up my mental health, suggesting I was unstable and had manipulated everyone. They questioned Graham's objectivity as family. They claimed Dr. Cross had a vendetta against hospitals that disagreed with her. The proceedings lasted 3 days. On the final day, the judge made his ruling. He found that based on preponderance of evidence, Julian Reeves showed sufficient indicators of consciousness to warrant continued life support and transfer to a facility specializing in locked-in syndrome care. He ordered the hospital to facilitate immediate transfer and to preserve all medical records for the ongoing malpractice investigation. He also made a statement that would be quoted in medical journals for years. The declaration of brain death carries profound consequences. It determines whether a patient lives or dies. The protocols for such determination must be thorough, rigorous, and beyond question. In this case, they were not. The failure to detect consciousness in a patient who is clearly aware represents a catastrophic breakdown in medical practice that demands accountability. Julian was transferred to a specialized neurological facility within 24 hours. The new medical team was shocked at his case, horrified that he'd been misdiagnosed for so long. They immediately began intensive rehabilitation, communication therapy, physical therapy for whatever muscle function could be recovered, psychological counseling for the trauma he'd endured. The lead physician, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, told me that some locked-in patients could recover partial movement over time, that new technologies might help Julian communicate more easily, that his prognosis wasn't hopeless. But she was also honest about the reality. Julian would likely never fully recover. 6 months of medical neglect, of being treated as brain dead while conscious, had caused damage that couldn't be undone. The psychological trauma alone would take years to address. Julian had experienced something like being buried alive, aware but unable to scream, surrounded by people who treated him as already dead. The malpractice lawsuit moved forward. David Kleinman was relentless, deposing everyone involved in Julian's initial diagnosis, uncovering a pattern of rushed assessments and inadequate testing. It turned out Julian wasn't the only patient who'd been misdiagnosed. 3 other families came forward with similar stories, patients declared brain dead who showed possible signs of consciousness that were ignored. The hospital settled 18 months after the initial incident. Terms were confidential, but David told me the amount was substantial enough to cover Julian's lifetime medical care, our financial losses, and punitive damages. More importantly, the settlement required the hospital to completely overhaul their brain death protocols, to to bring in independent consciousness assessments for all such determinations, and to establish a patient advocacy program. It wasn't enough. Money couldn't give Julian back the time he'd lost, couldn't erase the trauma, couldn't restore the life we'd planned. But it was acknowledgement, validation, that what happened to him was wrong, was preventable, was the result of systemic failure and institutional indifference. Julian made slow progress over the following years. With intensive therapy and assistive technology, he regained some movement in his left hand, enough to use a specialized computer interface that tracked micro-movements and translated them into speech. The first time I heard his synthesized voice saying, "I love you," I cried for an hour. He started writing about his experience, using the computer interface to type slowly but persistently. His account of being conscious while declared brain-dead was published in medical journals, presented at conferences, used in medical school ethics courses. Julian became an advocate for patients with consciousness disorders, for better diagnostic protocols, for recognition that absence of movement doesn't mean absence of awareness. 5 years after that first night when his eyes blinked out our wedding date in binary, we sat together on the deck of our new house, modified for accessibility, filled with equipment that helped him communicate and function. Julian was typing something on his computer, working on testimony for a congressional hearing about patient rights. I watched him work, still amazed by his persistence, his refusal to be defined by what was done to him. Through his computer voice, he asked if I ever regretted staying, regretted fighting when everyone said I should let go. I told him never, not for a second, that knowing he was there and being told I was imagining it was horrible, but leaving him would have been worse. He typed out his response, letter by letter. "You saved me. Not just physically. You saved me by believing I was still human when everyone else decided I wasn't. That's everything." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset, holding the hand that could still squeeze back. The binary code that started everything was now tattooed on my wrist. Help. A reminder that consciousness can survive in the smallest signals, that love means listening even when everyone says you're hearing nothing, that some rescues happen one blink at a time.